Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event on establishing global anti-counterfeiting norms to protect consumers from dangerous counterfeit products. My name is Becca Trait. I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, covering the future of retail and digital transformations. The Center for Data Innovation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank focusing on the intersection of data, technology, and public policy. Today, we're going to discuss the future of anti-counterfeiting and how the public and private sectors can work together to establish global norms and best practices that protect consumers and businesses and respect intellectual property rights. Dangerous counterfeit products, from medications to cosmetics to electronics, pose a significant threat to consumers and their safety, and counterfeiters exploit online marketplaces and tools to reach unexpected customers. Fortunately, the United States and European Union have each developed best practices to address the issue of counterfeiting, and these practices have significant overlaps. Using these agreed-upon practices to establish global norms can help policymakers in other countries develop anti-counterfeiting initiatives, streamline compliance across all online platforms and marketplaces, and create a unified global front against counterfeiting. If you haven't already seen it, the Center recently released a report on the overlapping practices in the EU and the US. That report is available on our website, DataInnovation.org. Today's panel is meant to be an open discussion. So for those watching online, you can submit and vote on questions using Slido. If you're watching on the Center for Data Innovation's website, you can find the link below the video to Slido. If you're on one of the other streaming platforms, such as YouTube, you can find the link in the video description. We also encourage you to share your thoughts and reactions to the event on Twitter and on social media using the hashtag DataInnovation. We have a great lineup of panelists today. Please welcome Jennifer Blank, Attorney Advisor at the United States Patent and Trademark Office, David M. Luna, Chair of the Anti-Illicit Trade Expert Group, Business at OECD, and the Chair of the United States Council for International Businesses Anti-Illicit Trade Committee, Megan Glibben, Director of Customs and Trade Facilitation at the U.S. Council for International Business, and the International Chamber of Commerce's representative to the World Customs Organization's Harmonious Systems Committee. Patrick Kilbride, Senior Vice President of the Global Innovation Policy Center at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Secretary Elaine Marshall, Secretary of State of North Carolina, and Pedor Strauskowski, Senior Economist at the OECD. I want to thank you all for being here today. To begin, I would like to actually pose my first question to David, since I know you'll be leaving us in a few short moments. So I was hoping you could start us off. To what extent, to begin, is anti-counterfeiting a problem in e-commerce, and what do you think the impact is to online customers and consumers?
Yeah, so good morning, and thank you, Becca, for the question. Let me also thank the Center for Data Innovation for your leadership and for also organizing today's discussion. As you mentioned, public-private partnerships and cooperation across sectors are critical to confront the pernicious threat of today's illicit trade and counterfeits. This is why Business at OECD is working with the OECD to realize a dynamic public-private partnership to address not only illicit trade, but the illicit trade and counterfeits across e-commerce platforms. Now, to your specific question, look, the illicit trade was already booming pre-COVID-19, and it has further accelerated during the pandemic, especially across e-commerce platforms and online marketplaces. As more consumers shop online, fakes are flooding not only American markets, but markets all around the world. And we saw this through the trafficking and production of fake pharmaceuticals, personal protective equipment, frauds, and the various coronavirus phishing scams that we saw during the pandemic. But it's not only the economic or reputational harm, as was stated at the beginning, and it is also impacts to the public and health of consumers around the world. For example, from counterfeit drugs to therapeutics, a lot of medicines that are the consumers use to treat cholesterol, cancer, heart, and other illnesses and diseases oftentimes are sold with inactive or no ingredients at all. In some instances, some of these products are very toxic, As I mentioned, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw too many of these pharmaceutical products online impacting consumers and their families, but also from electronics that contain hazardous materials to, airbags that are in our cars that are meant to protect our safety, and to lithium batteries that explode, counterfeit baby milk, baby carriers, toys, and cosmetics as well that cause severe skin reactions or even infections to counterfeit food and spirits across industries and across markets. And again, this is why public-private partnerships are very critical. I think it is that collective action as entities to work not only with government, the private sector, and civil societies to mitigate the harms by today's counterfeits, especially across e-commerce marketplaces. Becca, I think you're muted.
Thank you so much. I just want to say thank you for your comments. And I was saying one of the things that makes counterfeiting such a appropriate topic and such a broad topic is the effect it has on consumers. I would also love to talk about, though, the effect that it can have on economies, both local and national. Secretary Marshall, you have established the North Carolina Anti-Counterfeiting Task Force, and I know you've done a lot in protecting the economy of North Carolina from counterfeit goods. Would you like to speak to that?
Thank you. I'm delighted, and thank you for this opportunity to participate with this panel. I guess I'm kind of in a unique position. The Secretary of State of North Carolina is charged with registering North Carolina trademarks. But our mission and our charge is to protect any trademark, not just those that are North Carolina marks, but national marks. So with the explosive growth of e-commerce, especially at the height of the COVID, it is just much easier for consumers or for counterfeiters to target those consumers. It's easier to make the connection. So not all of my colleagues, secretaries of state, do this function. We're unique here because I have prosecutorial authority and staff and investigative staff here that's dedicated to the crimes that we're charged with enforcing. In some states, it's the Attorney General office. Frankly, in some states, there's not much at all, which is a soft spot for counterfeiters. We've known for years that the internet is creating a perfect storm. People felt like they had to shop online during the COVID, and so those that weren't using it before found that they basically had to dig in on that. And so counterfeiting is the advance guard of global counterfeiting hierarchy that threatens public safety, just as David has mentioned, and it threatens the economy. There are legitimate manufacturers out there and people that support those manufacturers that are losing business to the counterfeiters, and that takes away the underpinning of our economy. So when it comes down to coalition building, which we've done at the state, local, and federal level for years, that's been a key ingredient to our success with counterfeit goods. I first got into it when one of our favorite entertainments in North Carolina, NASCAR, invited me to come to one of the big racetracks, and they wanted to talk about how their logos and proprietary symbols and everything were being counterfeited. And they wanted the state to step up its actions because we had district attorneys who didn't want to prosecute, didn't know how to prosecute, sloughed it off as being a civil matter, which puts then the burden on the victim. And why should the victim be forced with the cost of a legal action if there's another alternative? And besides, civil actions seldom curtail further activities in this area. So we had to train prosecutors. We've had to train judges. We've got it included into the prosecutor's manual, law enforcement manual. We have met layer upon layer upon layer of activities to fill in the gaps here in order to get an anti-counterfeiting effort in North Carolina.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I think I mean, North Carolina has kind of been a leader in this space, especially with the task force, but I also think it's really important to focus on not just the impact it has on consumers, but that impact on local economies and the actual effect for legitimate businesses and legitimate manufacturers. As I mentioned in the beginning, the real focus of our discussion today is going to be on the establishment of best practices. So I would sort of like to turn into that angle. I would like to direct my next question to Megan. As the International Chamber of Commerce representative to the World Customs Organization's Harmonious Systems Committee, how do you think that a set of global norms, so that sort of really specific breakdown of what everyone is doing or should be doing, would help to standardize or change the customs approaches around the world?
Hi, so Becca first, thank you for the invite. Thank you for allowing me to join David here from a USCIB perspective. So I really want to look to some different work that we do at USCIB. Just for awareness, USCIB is the US affiliate to business at OECD, the industry voice into the OECD. This is an area where we at the domestic level are heavily engaged with our partners at business at OECD or BIAC, based out of Paris, right, who's working in public-private partnerships with the OECD Task Force on Countering Illicit Trade. This is where we have come together to do a series of projects, including related to the good work the task force has done on free trade zones, as well as the work that we're doing on e-commerce in a future phase 2 stream. This is where we can come together to create a voluntary structure based on evidence and research to help inform policymakers. And so with regard to the OECD, this is where we're really driving our anti-illicit trade efforts and the work of the committee here at USCIB, as well as the work at the BIAC Anti-Illicit Trade Expert Group to move forward on addressing the challenges we're seeing in e-commerce tied to marketplaces and other intermediaries. I would just say that as it relates to the World Customs Organization, we at USCIB are heavily engaged with our partners, the International Chamber of Commerce, as it relates to WCO matters. And the WCO has a framework of standards regarding e-commerce. There are some aspects related to anti-illicit trade where we encourage them to look at the good work of the OECD task force. Thank you for the question, and please feel free to ask other questions related to those matters. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much for that and for all of the background on the work that's being done at OECD and at the World Customs Organization. For the group, I would really like to talk about what type of pathways that, in your opinion, exist to establishing global norms for anti-counterfeiting, and then what lessons maybe we can learn from some past initiatives. Peter, would you like to start us off? Oh, I think you're muted. There you go.
Can you hear me? I hope you can.
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. So thank you so much for this excellent question. And my name is Piotr Ryszowski, and actually at the OECD, I work at the Secretariat where I manage a task force on counterfeit trade that Megan mentioned. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this excellent meeting. That was a very good question, how to get to a best selection of best practices, right? And what are the past initiatives that we can learn from? These are two big questions. For the first one, how to get there? Well, we must not forget that an obvious thing relates to e-commerce. It's borderless, right? A platform located in one country is active by the nature of internet in all countries in the world. So existing best practices should cover all possible platforms located in all countries, because the problem is really knows no borders. It's jurisdiction neutral, I would say. So what an effort can start with is to provide policymakers or those that will be looking at these best practices with a map, with a taxonomy of existing efforts that different platforms in different countries apply to address certain problems. Such taxonomy could help in establishing some gaps that might exist, or efforts or areas where efforts need to be really strong and focused, right? At the OECD, we have done it. We have already started providing policymakers with a map of efforts done by online platforms in several areas, such as collaboration with customs, such as work with rights holders, or collaboration or work with customers, right? But still, lots of things need to be done, given that, of course, e-commerce is borderless. That brings me to the second question you asked. What are the past lessons that we can lever to advance our work on e-commerce? And here, of course, I keep in mind our work on free trade zones. There are many similarities between free trade zones and e-commerce. First of all, both are sort of intermediaries in global trade. Secondly, both deal with global aspects, global trade, free trade zones, or borderless e-commerce, right? And here also, we at the OECD have developed a code of conduct for free trade zones that we must observe in order to avoid being abused by criminals. There are some lessons, right? Like close collaboration with zones was essential to establish what can be done and what is relevant, right? Because what we want to avoid is some, as we say in Polish, some, cloud of gas that prevents people from really touching the subject, but creates an image of doing something, right? So we don't want this. We want to really make sure that we address right points, that we hit the nail, we really focus on those areas where action is essential. That must be done in collaboration with zones. Even though governments have best experts ever, they are not industry, they are not zones. So zones were really helpful in giving us a hand. And same thing applies to e-commerce platforms. There are e-commerce platforms that want to be clean, that want to avoid being abused by counterfeiters and criminals. So it sounds natural that working hand in hand with them on determining those areas where best practices should be focused on is a natural next steps. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for your answer. Jumping off of something that you mentioned about making sure the practices are pretty focused, how should stakeholders balance that? So obviously they need to create best practices that are specific enough to have an impact on preventing counterfeiting, but you also need to balance making sure they're broad enough that counterfeiters aren't able to easily circumvent them. Is there any thoughts you would like to give, or anyone in the group would like to give on that?
Well, let me just briefly follow up on that question. Of course, there's always a matter of balance, right? So put it differently, we must set the bar high enough to address the problem, but not too high so that platforms can really make it, right? There is one easy solution to solve all the problems with e-commerce platforms is to turn off the internet and shut down all the e-commerce platforms, right? But that looks like curing dandruff by decapitation. This is not something that we want. To achieve this balance, of course, what we need to do is to engage in in-depth dialogue with platforms, but not only with platforms, also with rights holders, with consumers associations, and with enforcement, to make sure that the balance is set at the right level, that the bar is high enough, but not too high.
For the group, just as we're thinking about the way setting the bar, as Piotr said, high but not too high, do you feel that anti-counterfeiting practices should be voluntary or mandatory? And what role should private sector actors and government agencies play in developing those norms? I would love to go through the panel. So if you would like to start, Jennifer, I'll just go across.
I think that something that we have learned through many attempts to find global solutions is that, sort of Piotr mentioned, you really can't have a one-size-fits-all solution. Trying to find, for example, legislation that will work for countries in different states of development, and also that will not something that an Amazon can do and afford. And I'm sorry, Chris is not here to be able to tell us about some of those efforts, but the kind of efforts that they can afford to put in place voluntarily, or even if it were legislatively, is not the same that perhaps a smaller entity trying to become the next Amazon and they try to break into the market. It has to be something that they can also accomplish and protect consumers, but not prevent them from developing an honest business. So I think that's a great challenge that we have to face. I think that we've seen much benefit through voluntary standards, where we can bring the people to the table who need to be. The problem, of course, then is the bad actors who won't come to the table. So you're probably looking at some kind of combination. Many people on this call may be familiar with the DHS report that came out in 2020. That was a collaborative effort among U.S. Government agencies to try to identify the way forward in preventing counterfeiting. And it was a combination of government action, voluntary action. And one thing I'd like to mention that was a part of that report was the public awareness angle. We talk about norms or approaches to stopping the sale of counterfeit products, but we can't forget that if we can choke off demand, we can really choke off the counterfeiting. So, for example, PTO has been very involved in public awareness campaigns. Our Go for Real campaign, PSA is coming out. That has to be part of the conversation too, how to alert consumers to purchase wisely.
Awesome. Megan, would you like to give a perspective on voluntary versus mandatory?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Thank you for that. So I would agree with the not one size fits all approach because governments are in different place. Industry is in different place, right? We're a US-based trade association. Based on all of our work, a voluntary approach makes the most sense for some of the reasons highlighted. And then, of course, that enables a country at the national level to be able to regulate, for example, or change statute, depending upon the issue. So again, a voluntary approach. And I think it's the real need that we saw even with the DHS report was having trade stakeholders at the table, having all the relevant stakeholders at the table. And in the case of the work that we're doing with BIAC and OECD, there is a mechanism by which we do bring industry to the table to help inform, as Piotr said, with member states participating in the task force, with customs, with all the relevant government agencies. So I would say not a prescriptive manner, one size fits all. Enable industry to engage and all relevant stakeholders to engage in the process, and voluntary.
Awesome.
I can place a comment, an emphasis behind that. We participated with a group for verifybeforeyoubuy.org. That is an education campaign for folks to check out whether the pharmacy that they're potentially dealing with is legitimate or if it's fake. Because we find that the US government tells us that 97% of the pharmacies that are selling online really are fake pharmacies and not Canadian as they depict themselves. And we found one of our greatest allies was the Family Physicians Association. They had no idea. They just for years scratched their head when they had prescribed the medicine that they thought was going to treat the condition. They knew they had no question about it. That was the right medicine. And a patient would come back a week or whatever period of time, and their condition had not changed. And they would think they were not taking the medicine as prescribed. And then they started working with patients and found out they would swear they were taking it just like it was prescribed. And they had no idea that these pharmacies were fake. And so educating them and helping them educate their patients, because we don't have enough money or exposure to educate everybody, but to get those physician providers to know that this is a resource that they themselves, the providers, or they can give to their patients was a huge, huge impact.
Piotr, did you have a comment to add to that? You looked very excited by what she was saying.
Well, yes. Firstly, what Ms. Marshall said, I fully agree. I mean, examples with Canadian, fake Canadian pharmacies or like fake UK pharmacies are really shocking. And I only highlight a need for dedicated policy action in that area. But what I wanted just to comment is the question, mandatory or voluntary, right? To me, this is not a question mandatory or voluntary. I would say both must be carried out hand in hand, right? Internet is borderless. It's a global problem. So we must remember that arriving at a mandatory action would require agreement of all countries in the world, which is a huge challenge, right? But it doesn't mean that we should not stop trying this. And all these efforts at, for example, WCO that we see, they should be really applauded. But at the same time, recognizing it's a big challenge, we must pursue with voluntary efforts. We must highlight best practices. We must reward those actors that want to do more than the mandatory framework requires.
Nice. Thank you very much. Patrick, did you have anything you wanted to add to this topic as well?
I'll just comment that, I think it's very important to set norms. I think a prerequisite to that, to effective norms, is setting expectations. And so, a number of the speakers have mentioned public awareness efforts. I think that's critically important, not just, in terms of consumers who need to be aware of threats to public health and safety, to their personal health and safety, also economic impacts to workers, to jobs, to businesses, fundamental impacts on our rule of law environment. When you think about why we have trademark laws to protect brands and logos, it's our ability to build identities and reputations and customer trust within the economy. And so that is critically important to basic forms of economic activity. And so this is what we're protecting with these anti-counterfeiting efforts, is all of these sort of essential building blocks of our economic prosperity. That's important not just for consumers, but for governments, for academics, and I think we haven't quite wrapped our hands around the scope of the problem. All credit to Piat and his colleagues at the OECD, who I think have been, on the front lines of helping to develop effective metrics. But we have a long way to go. We don't really fully understand the scope of counterfeits in our economy. We don't know always where the chief dangers lie. But if we help to create expectations of a rule of law environment for our economy, whether it's physical retail or brick and mortar or e-commerce, then we can help to create the conditions where we can effectively crack down on counterfeits. So let's set those expectations, and then effective norms can follow. In terms of voluntary versus mandatory, I think in industry we always know that when we're not proactive, government will step in. And so I think you've seen, in particular in the e-commerce space, some of those companies with the scale, with the bandwidth to address these problems in a more systematic fashion from a private sector side are doing that. And that's helping to drive government as well to address this problem. And I think in the past, we've been in a more reactive mode, more ad hoc. I think what you're seeing today is the emergence of a systemic effort to curb trade in counterfeits. And frankly, that's in part because of the e-commerce space, right? For all the reasons that the speakers have already mentioned, that during the pandemic, more than ever, we came to rely on the availability, the ability to access goods quickly via a safe online space delivered right to our door. Now that that threat of counterfeits is not, managed by a middleman. It's not coming in through the container load. It's coming direct to consumer in small parcels. And so it's made it very real for us. So we have a huge opportunity here. And I think this is exactly the time to take advantage of it. So, the emergence of this challenge with e-commerce, we should really see it as a real opportunity.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, the new reliance, but also the new attachment to e-commerce for consumers, like you said, it opens up the door for that kind of direct to consumer sale. It's not necessarily people buying fake products like fake Gucci purses on Canal Street. They might be ordering these directly from the counterfeiters or directly from the source, whether or not they're aware of it.
And that makes the counterfeiters more vulnerable. They're in a position today where they're not hiding behind a middleman, a distributor. They are, in some cases, marketing directly or even customizing products, counterfeit products for a customer. And that gives us an ability to find them, to track them, to all the information sharing that can help to bring more transparency and more rule of law to this space.
Yeah, actually, on the role of transparency and the opportunity that e-commerce and that direct to consumer connection presents, I would love to talk about what role we think data sharing will need to take in stopping counterfeit. So that would be data sharing between manufacturers to law enforcement agencies, between law enforcement agencies that are, maybe international, local, national, and then how that robust data sharing can be used to stop counterfeiting, especially if we consider that it's a global problem. Secretary Marshall, I know the task force does a lot with local law enforcement. So would you like to start us off?
I'd be delighted to. Quite frankly, I could not do what we're doing without broad support of law enforcement, whether it's local, whether it's state, whether it's federal, whether it's international in some cases. And we've developed those relationships. And our law does allow us to do a few things a little bit faster than federal law does as far as investigating packages and that kind of thing. So it's not that we're dependent upon them, they're also dependent upon us. So it is quite a two-way street. When you talk about data, something that has not been mentioned so far in this conversation has been what would, I think, be voluntary encouragement of the manufacturers to monitor their data about the contracts that they're entering into for manufacturing in various points around the world, their raw materials that they're sending there or having made there, and the amount of slippage, the amount of unaccounted for goods that turn into, when we see counterfeit luxury pocketbooks and the fabric it's stolen, it's confiscated fabric. It is not something that's replicated. So keeping the supply chain of the manufacturers on a little bit tighter string, I think, is a good place to start. If they are using their data to really dashboard out their raw materials versus their end product, they could probably see some serious leakage.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. And I think it's really the data sharing that we can, and the information that regulators and policymakers and law enforcement could get from manufacturers, I think is a really interesting avenue to explore as we look forward in anti-counterfeiting, because that data, if a law enforcement agency knows about a counterfeit product that exists somewhere, if they've maybe seen like a specific counterfeit medication existing in Europe, and they're able to share that information with the FDA or with the FBI here in the United States, that could really provide an avenue for the FBI to begin an investigation and to get those products, to get them out of the US market before they actually harm somebody. Jen, would you like to speak to the the patent organization's strategy for sort of protecting the rights, especially as it relates to counterfeit goods, counterfeit medications?
Yes, a good one of the things we do at the Patent and Trademark Office, and it, we're probably mostly known for granting patents and registering trademarks, but we do other things. And one of the things we do sits in my group, the Office of Policy and International Affairs. And a good part of what we do is working internationally with other countries and with industry to help improve IP regimes, which of course affects also commerce strategy. We can do this through capacity building, trainings, and we can deal directly. I frequently deal directly with, say, police, prosecutors, the judiciary, customs, to try to enhance not only the legal system, but also the application of the legal system. And e-commerce, of course, is at different levels of development. I cover Europe and Eurasia, other people cover other parts of the world, and trying to recognize where that country or industry or economy is and move them forward to that next step, give them assistance.
Okay. I would also love to talk, Patrick, with you about the way you think global norms could change or drive innovation. And I would also love to open that up to everyone, because I think everyone will have a perspective on that, but especially as we think about the potential changeover in patent law if we increase data sharing for manufacturers. What do you think that could do to innovation? Jennifer mentioned earlier that we need to make sure global norms don't stifle small businesses who are trying to become the next Amazon. You don't want to make them so broad that new entrants into the market don't really have a chance to compete. But how do you think these kind of global norms and regulations, global norms and practices would change or improve innovation?
It's a great question because I think when government tries to step in and manage a challenge, an industry challenge from on high, oftentimes you get market distortions, you get unintended consequences. You need only look at the challenges of regulating in the privacy space to understand, how that can limit investments and ability, room to maneuver in terms of innovation. And so I think the same is true in e-commerce. So it's just incredibly important that we always take a step back and first remind ourselves of the tremendous economic value of e-commerce in particular, that the benefits far outweigh the costs of counterfeiting, which exists anyway, but this is just a new manifestation, right? So we first need to have that reminder. Okay, let's level set and understand how important e-commerce is to our future prosperity, our ability to incorporate billions of people globally into an effective worldwide marketplace to build that global middle class. And with that, sort of as our foundation, say, what can we do to address the specific challenges? And I think, the conversation we've had about proactive, industry-driven, public-private partnership is exactly the right way. I think the first challenge is to understand the scope of problems. And so the Chamber, for instance, has been working with the U.S. government, specifically CBP and the National IPR Center, to develop data sharing programs where we've had companies in representative companies in industries that are particularly vulnerable to counterfeiting or that pose a particular risk to public health and safety, have been actively sharing their own information with government investigators, with CBP field officers, to help to identify the networks of counterfeiters globally, and to make sure that the data available to the U.S. government, for instance, is supplemented by the data available to these companies on a worldwide basis. I think there's just, we're really just at the tip of the iceberg there. There's so much more work to be done, not only in this sort of corporate to government, private to public information sharing, but in the other direction as well. We need governments to have the authority and the willingness to share timely information with companies that when there are seizures, for instance, that affect their products. But we also need the public cooperation of the type that's taking place at the OECD and elsewhere. We need the private to private information sharing. And so, I think Amazon was raised earlier, so I won't feel bad about chiming in there to point to their annual brand protection report, where they prioritize working with other online retailers to share information about the identities and cases of counterfeiting, where they've identified information and where they can confirm some of that in many cases with industry partners. So there's really just a whole host of options available to us, and I feel like we've only just begun, but this is the time, this is the moment when we can really bring a lot of important ideas to fruition.
Awesome. Jumping off of that, actually, I have another question for you, Jennifer. The idea that there should be, robust data sharing, and it should be public to private, private to private, and also private to public. What do you think, as an attorney and also as a representative from the Patent Office, do you think that may have an impact on the intellectual property rights of property holders? So, for example, if you're a handbag maker and you find out about a product seizure, and you're required to share that with another handbag maker, to what extent should that information be shared? And then how can the government ensure that while the information is being shared, the intellectual property of the handbag designer, so the number of buckles that go on a bag, the number of stitches in a specific portion of the bag? How can they ensure that that information is protected?
This is a good question. A couple of things to think about. When you're talking about data sharing amongst manufacturers, you certainly have to be cognizant of laws that cover relationships between competitors that have nothing to do with IP. So that's going to be one of your first stops. Once you've decided that you can do such sharing, what would constitute something that would be damaging to a company and having to reveal the information? Some of it might be, again, have nothing to do with IP. There might be just a desire to keep some problems in-house. But when it comes to, I think one of the things we talk about or think about most commonly when we're talking about sharing IP is the idea of a trade secret, something that that you keep close hold, and if you share it, it is no longer valuable to you. I think that all trade secrets and any other kind of IP have to be shared in a manner that is voluntary, that is protected, that is appropriate to the purpose. You certainly aren't going to get much voluntary cooperation if companies feel that they are going to be forced to damage themselves in their cooperation. So there are many ways to share many pieces of valuable data that do not negatively impact a company and through their IP data or otherwise.
Yeah, did you have a point to make as well?
Yes, actually 2 points. First, I fully agree with what Jennifer has said. For many companies, data sharing might be a cost, right? It's just a cost, right? And we should not forget that any anti-counterfeiting action taken by rights holders or e-commerce platforms is a cost. And at the end of the day, companies will ask themselves, are we really willing to pay this cost? If, for example, some other platforms in other countries do not need to do it, right? So there must be a payoff for this cost, be it either effective anti-counterfeiting action that results from this data sharing, or some sort of, well, that's what we think at the OECD, sort of certificate or acknowledging on the market of those market actors that do a good job, that proactively go 1 mile ahead, right? The second point I want to make is that actually even the most effective action taken by platforms or rights holders should be always paralleled with educational efforts, right? Because some consumers don't care. Some consumers are not aware about counterfeiting, right? Data sharing, public-private, will not do the job on our own. We should always keep in mind this is just one leg. We should stand on 2 legs, even more legs, right, to be effective.
And I think that definitely. Oh, sorry, Megan. Did you want to?
No, go ahead and finish your remark, and then I'll jump in.
Of course. I was just going to say, I think that definitely is something we need to consider in the sense that, as you mentioned earlier, one leg of this is also getting rid of the demand and making sure there's not just regulating away counterfeits, but making sure there's not demand for counterfeits. Megan, you had a comment about data that you wanted to add?
Yes, so I want to step back because I sit in 2 unique worlds, right? I lead our customs and trade facilitation work. I work very closely with my committee chair on anti-illicit trade and our members. And so I just want to step back on the point of data because I think it's a nebulous topic and we're not always on the same page with what we're saying. So one point to Jennifer, I know my members are very interested in protecting their confidential business information, right? Domestically and internationally. I think that's a critical thing we all must consider in sort of the trade secrets nature of that and how important commercial data is. I think more generally, if I step back and say, where do USCIB members sit on the issue of data sharing? So in this context that we're talking about, voluntary, right? Agreeing with what other people say. But I think we need to consider what data we're talking about, who owns it, what's appropriate to be shared, and under what mechanisms it's to be shared, right? So I think as Jennifer and Piat talked about, sort of industry to industry sharing is one thing, industry to government sharing is another, and government to government sharing is another, right? And as it relates to the work stream here, like I said, voluntary data sharing is critical. And I just want to step back in that broader context from a USCIB perspective. Our members support law enforcement data sharing for law enforcement purposes, right, under appropriate mechanisms, with guardrails to ensure that that information is used for those law enforcement purposes and for those parties authorized to access it, right? And no sort of unofficial access and off-market use. And so data for companies of all sizes, as Piat said, is a costly thing, right? Depends on what data you're talking about, but to add another data element to the data set that a company already maintains is a huge cost, and appropriate mechanisms to sharing that can also come with costs. So I hope that helps. And I just want to also chime in and say, you know, I think we were talking about earlier this issue of sort of education and public service announcements. I think that's really important, but a coordinated approach to that from a government perspective across agencies, I think, is critical. Thank you for allowing me to step in here.
Oh my God, of course. Thank you so much for giving your insights. And I really actually would love to just have a short discussion about the role of consumer education in stopping counterfeiting. As Piat said earlier, you need to sort of get rid of the demand. And I think a lot of people associate counterfeit goods with counterfeit luxury products, or maybe like certain consumer products that they don't feel pose like a danger to them. It's not something you're consuming. It's not something you're eating. So how can government agencies, private organizations, how can they get the information out there that it's not just a fake handbag? It's not just a stolen IP. There is a danger to all of these products to consumers. Secretary Marsh. Oh, please.
After the secretary, of course.
Well, it's very, very important. I can tell you, as we've been 20 years now doing this, we first faced the public criticizing sheriffs who did some raids. The criticism was these are just immigrant people trying to make a living. And we helped them with response editorials. We have done a lot of press releases on some of the damages. I mean, we have found fake tourniquets here. And when you communicate that to the outdoor community, the sportsman community, the rescue squad community, that gets their attention. And when you can find a product that people would not necessarily think about being faked, I mean, they don't think about much of anything being faked except purses and sunglasses. So raising their awareness about the type of things that can be fake. My mantra is, if we can make it, somebody else can fake it. So, and trying to educate the public about tells about what would be the sign of a fake, because sometimes that's very, very hard. We're trying to protect the legitimate merchants, but we're also trying to do an education job, kind of event by event, to let newspaper. I mean, we have local, very legitimate sock manufacturers in North Carolina who were embroidering Disney characters on the socks, which they had no license to do. So it's educating some of the manufacturers themselves that is not a free public use logo and character. So it takes a lot of different topics, a lot of different varieties, a continuous effort on it, to get the information out there about potential fakes and where they can be found. I look at fakes the same way I look at cybersecurity. It is a race without a finish. We've just got to continued input every day we possibly can about the concerns. And then for those where they think it's not, a pocketbook or a t-shirt is not harmful, think about the people who are manufacturing. Think about the legitimate people that are selling them. Think about the folks that are supporting your town ball teams and others who are trying to compete legitimately out there. And so there's unfair competition. They can't compete with the fakes out there. So we're just trying to do a little bit of consciousness raising everywhere we go.
Awesome. We have about 10 minutes left in our chat. Oh, I'm sorry, Piat, would you like to add something?
Well, yes, let me just jump in, because You mentioned like counterfeit luxury goods making no harm, right?
Mhm.
And well, in this famous novel, Alice in Wonderland, there was a character called Mad Hatter, right? And there was a reason for that. In Victorian England, there was mercury used to produce hats. Consequently, producers of hats, they over time being exposed to mercury, they became mad usually, or
Mhm.
they had health problems. And this shows that actually production of any product, if it's not subject to strict norms that that protect consumers, can lead to some health and safety risks. Even hats, even bags, even watches, right?
Mhm.
There can be always some components that are dangerous. So we must not forget that it's not only fake pharmaceuticals that can pose health and safety risks. Any fake product, even watch, luxury bag, T-shirt, if it's not produced with strict norms about chemicals used for it, can lead to some risks. That was just a side note. Thank you.
Jennifer, did you have a thought?
Yes, I just wanted to chime in on one of the approaches we take is getting to the youth market. More and more they're the customers of today, which blows my mind since I wasn't buying anything when I was a kid. But they're the consumers of tomorrow. So if you can get the message through for respecting IP and understanding dangers early, you are educating the consumers of tomorrow. The other thing we do, many other things, but one thing I want to mention, we support a lot of innovation-oriented activities, camp innovation for the young people, collegiate innovators. Those who innovate and understand the effort and importance of developing new thoughts, products, etc., will respect the effort in others, and also that has a side effect of creating again an educated and aware consumer base.
Awesome, wonderful. I think since we have about 10 minutes left, I would love to jump into some audience questions and then regroup at the end with one final question for everyone. One audience question we received, and this is for anyone who would like to jump in and answer. Would you adjust the geopolitical landscape, particularly with regards to China and the United States and the subsequent impact on counterfeiting? And how would you address that? Patrick, would you like to take a stab at that from a sort of global perspective?
Well, sure. Strictly from an empirical standpoint,
Of course.
the chamber's done reports that show 84% of counterfeits being sourced from China. So I think you simply can't ignore the reality, and it's certainly not. They don't have a monopoly on counterfeits, but it's a very real issue. So any conversation about counterfeiting has to begin with China and Hong Kong, and go from there. And as we're looking at measures to track networks and understand channels of distribution, that becomes just a critical part of the conversation. I think from an industry point of view, we're always looking for measures for constructive engagement, channels for constructive engagement. So the chamber, for instance, has run a U.S.-China IP cooperation dialogue now for many years, not because we're not very, very focused on the problems, but because it's going to take cooperation to solve those problems.
Sort of refocusing a little back to best practices, both the United States and EU best practices contain aspects that would allow consumers to report counterfeits on different platforms. So for example, if you're an Amazon shopper and you find a counterfeit item, you would have the ability to report that item as counterfeit as you see fit. What do you think the consumer rule should be in reporting counterfeit items as they see them? And I open that up to anyone who would like to speak. Yeah, Secretary Marshall.
I think the consumer role is very, very important. We have, if the product is found in North Carolina, there's a complaint form on our website, which is sosnc.gov, only one dot, sosnc.gov. and that allows us to open up an investigation. I will tell you, though, that most of our cases come from manufacturers or retailers, from federal sources that are aware of product that's coming into the country, or the distribution hubs when they see a lot of same packages going to the same address. It used to be one big package. Now it's a lot of little small ones. That's a sign. That's a piece of data they share with us, if you will. So we can go along with the delivery and find out what's going on, and if enough probable cause, we can do more. So consumer information, but also a large part of it is our different partners.
Awesome. Would you expand on what some of those partners would be and how consumers could interface with them if they, felt the need?
Well, what usually happens is someone buys a product that's a brand name product, and then they complain to that company, the local retail outlet, for that. And then sometimes the company right away, upon looking at it or looking at the insides of it, say, this is not our product. And then fortunately, the companies will know that we have this anti-counterfeiting task force here. They will refer that case to the task force, and then we will deal with the person who purchased it to try to go up the stream to find out where it came from. And we are, we can knock off the street dealers, but that's like weeds. We'd rather go further up the supply chain if we can, within North Carolina or even outside of North Carolina, with federal partners, letting them know what we've found out.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I think we'll redirect back, and I have one last question for all of you if you would love to answer. In terms of addressing counterfeits online, what in your perspective would success be, say 5 to 10 years down the road? I'll start with you, Jennifer.
What would success be? Lightning round. I think that I'm very focused right now on reducing demand. And part of that is, we've already talked about education. Part of that is, and of course the platforms has a huge role in education, and a great opportunity because they have the direct ears of the consumers. And also better ability to identify and move on the sellers.
Wonderful. Megan, would you like to give a perspective?
Yeah, I think for USCIB, an immediate action would be seeing the formal kickoff of our phase 2 e-commerce work that we're doing in partnership with Business at OECD and OECD under the public-private partnership, and seeing future phases of that work come together to help inform policymakers. It's more of a short-term goal, not so much a 5 to 10 year, but the next several years for sure.
But I think the next several years will be critical in kind of developing success in that long term, with that long-term perspective. Piotr, would you like to give a perspective on the future?
Well, sure. Well, just like Megan had said, to me, a success would be to have an established set of best practices, voluntary best practices, for those platforms that really want to join a set of stakeholders that share global views of rules-based international order. But at the same time, I should keep in mind that 5 years, it's a long time horizon. 5 years back from now, if someone told me that there is a pandemic ahead of us and a big war, I would say, come on, get a life, right? So I should be also patient.
Wonderful. Patrick, would you like to give an answer?
I think success begins with less finger pointing, more cooperation, and a laser focus on the bad actors, so that legitimate businesses can all work together to help consumers, to help governments. In 5 years, when we identify a counterfeit in the system, we ought to be able to trace it right back to the originator, right back to the money people who are financing that illicit activity. We have the tools today, and this is the moment.
Wonderful. And Secretary Marshall, would you close us out?
I certainly would be glad to. Success to me would be more states having a response. When a citizen in, pick a state, Ohio, California, where do they go? Reaching the federal government for a system is a daunting challenge to know where to go and how to proceed with it. Whereas if you had legislators that believed in beefing up this as strengthening the businesses that they have within their jurisdiction and protecting them from illegal competition, you would think they would invest in state level education and enforcement activities.
Amazing. Wonderful. This has been so great. Before we close, I just want to thank everyone for their participation, for the audience, for listening and engaging with us today. This is a really important and a developing area, and I look forward to continuing to engage with all of you as we sort of move forward on these issues. To close, I would just like to remind everyone that the Center for Data Innovation has a report out on best practices. You can find that report at datainnovation.org. And to again, thank everyone for joining us today.